Hello, good evening. My name is Mary. Um, Thank you all for joining us for our conservation conversation wonderful wetlands event. It is so great to see some new and familiar names popping up on our Zoom. We're here tonight to just celebrate our overall enthusiasm for wetland conservation. And in fact, if you didn't know, about a third of the acres conserved by Capital Land Trust are categorized as wetlands. And that's not even counting the 19 miles of marine shoreline and 57 miles of freshwater shoreline. So thanks to our members and supporters who have helped us get this far, and we're looking forward to more wetland conservation in the future. So, just a little bit about Capital Land Trust. Some of you might be familiar with us, but in case you're not, and this is your first time engaging with us, we are a nonprofit land trust working around the greater Olympia area to preserve important landscapes like wetlands. We are part of a nationwide network of land trusts that work to protect important ecological and cultural areas. To date, we've conserved over 6,600 acres in the South Puget Sound and Chehalis Basin watersheds, and that's equal to about 8,700 football fields. That helps you kind of visualize that massive space that we've been able to protect. These special places support healthy water, healthy populations of fish and wildlife, and healthy people too. We also offer some recreation opportunities on our four public access preserves, which you can learn more about on our website. And something that I really love about the work that Capital Land Trust does is that the work that we do is in perpetuity or forever. So the lands that we conserve and some of the behind the scenes that you'll see this evening will have positive impacts well into the future for our area. I also want to take a moment to thank folks in the audience today who have donated their time, dollars, or expertise to our conservation work that's resulted in the conservation of over 100 properties. So thank you all so much for your support. This evening, we are joined by Capital Land Trust Senior Land Projects Manager Laurence Reeves and local wildlife videographer Mike Melton. Laurence, I'd love to have you introduce yourself first, and then Mike, you can do the same.
Sure. Thanks, Mary. Yeah, my name is Laurence Reeves. I've been with Capital Land Trust for 17 years. I was the conservation director for quite a while, and now I'm in a different role, working fewer hours. Yeah, I do land acquisitions, write grants, and yeah, I just really enjoy working at Capital Land Trust, and it's always a pleasure to talk with our members and just let people know what we've been up to. So yeah, looking forward to this opportunity, and I'll pass it over to Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike, Mike Melton. I'm a volunteer with Capital Land Trust, which means basically that I get to play on Capital Land Trust property and take pictures. So, but it's a very difficult job. So, yeah, it's been a really fantastic to be able to help such a great organization over the last few years.
Great. Thank you both. It's so wonderful to have you both on our call tonight. So our evening is going to start off with Lawrence giving us an overview of what wetlands are and why we conserve them. And then he's going to, along the way, highlight some of the wetlands that we do conserve and some of the wildlife that lives there. After that, Mike is going to share his short film, Shaping the Salish Sea. That is a tongue twister. Beavers and salmon. His incredible footage and narration highlights the secret lives of two wetland-dependent animals, which are beavers and salmon, at our protected Twin Rivers Ranch Preserve. And it's really inspiring. I'm really excited to show you all tonight. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy learning more about wetlands, the different types of wetlands, and the ones that we conserve. So, over to you, Lawrence.
Great, thanks, Mary. So yeah, as Mary said, I'm going to give you sort of a brief overview of what wetlands are, and sort of in the context of Capital Land Trust preserves. I'm not a wetlands expert. I know that there are some people here who are, because I saw your names as you were logging on. For those of you who are wetlands experts, this might be a good time to go make some popcorn or walk the dog. Uh, but do come back, because Mike's video is excellent, and I think that you'll find it very interesting. So, just sort of an overview, what are wetlands? A wetland, commonly called a bog, a swamp, or a marsh, is a low-lying area of land that's saturated with water, either intermittently, seasonally, or permanently. There are freshwater wetlands and saltwater wetlands. Wetlands have hydric soils, which are soils that are saturated long enough to create low oxygen conditions in the soil. There are many different types of plants that have adapted to live in these conditions. These include submerged plants like eelgrass, floating plants like duckweed, or emergent plants that rise above the water surface like sedges and rushes. Wetlands are amongst the most productive habitats on Earth. They hold water for much longer than the surrounding uplands. And since water is the key to life, they're an important part of the ecosystem. So wetlands are important to protect because for a variety of reasons, but they provide a lot of ecosystem services to humans. And an ecosystem service is a service provided by nature typically for free. In terms of wetlands, one of the major services they provide is stormwater retention and flood control. So essentially, that just means the ability to absorb water and not have the water running down our streets or running in our basements or flooding uh, areas, highways, roads, that kind of thing. And because of their ability to store water, wetlands also provide water during dry periods by slowly releasing stored water into surrounding surface water and groundwater. They also help remove pollutants from water. Wetlands provide important habitat for many species of plants and animals that are dependent on wetland habitats for some or all stages of their life. Wetlands are also very diverse because they provide habitat to unique species that can't survive elsewhere. But they also provide habitat for a broader population of species that are more adaptable, but still rely on wetlands for things like reliable water, cover from predators, and dependable food sources. But despite all the benefits that wetlands provide, they're fragile habitats. They're directly damaged by human activities such as filling, draining, diking, and pollution, and indirectly through adjacent land use practices, climate change, and invasive species. Capital Land Trust strategic plan prioritizes the conservation of wetlands for these reasons. So I'm going to talk about some of the common wetland types in our area and highlight some examples of the wetlands that are on some of our preserves. I'll also share some of the plant species found in wetlands and some of the amazing wildlife that call these places home. So the first example is forested wetlands. A forested wetland is where soils are saturated or flooded for at least a portion of the growing season, and vegetation dominated by trees is adapted to tolerate these flooded conditions. So this is a photo of our Edwards conservation easement, where one of the dominant tree species is Sitka spruce. Sitka spruce typically um, can be in soils that are flooded for part of their life cycle. We often see rough-skinned newts in forested wetlands. Rough-skinned newt adults can be seen in moist forests that have access to ponds for breeding. And this is the Carlson Preserve. It's adjacent to the Edwards Conservation Easement and our Darling Creek Preserve, together totaling 342 acres of protected habitat. Forested wetlands are often dominated by trees like cottonwoods, Oregon ash, and alder. And this is a skunk cabbage, also known as a swamp lantern. Its name comes from its skunky odor, which attracts beetles to pollinate the flowers. It's one of the first plants to bloom in February and March. Scrub shrub wetlands are covered by woody vegetation, generally less than 20 feet tall, that grows in saturated soil conditions. This photo is of some willows and cattails at our Decker Creek Preserve, which spans the Mason County, Grays Harbor County line and drains into the Chehalis. This is a photo of a red osier dogwood. It's a shrub that grows up to 18 feet tall and is often found in wetlands. It's a great wildlife shrub because it forms bird-friendly thickets and it provides food for pollinators. And here we see a cedar waxwing eating a service berry. Uh, there's a lot of fruiting plants that are found in wetlands, and they provide food for a whole host of different animals. This is a photo collage of trail cams from our Inspiring Kids Preserve at a site where we restored a wetland. From the top left and going clockwise, you can see there's some coyotes, a porcupine, some raccoons, a barn owl, and deer that are all visiting the wetland. This is an aerial of our Blooms Preserve, which is down off of 113th and Little Rock Road. And this is our Kaiser Preserve, which is in the Green Cove Creek wetlands near the Evergreen State College. So emergent wetlands are a type of wetland that's flooded frequently. They're characterized by erect-rooted herbaceous plants that are generally smaller than shrubs. Vegetation examples include cattails, rushes, and sedges. So this is a great example of a rush. This whole area is down on our Inspiring Kids Preserve that used to be a hayfield. We had beavers move in and dam it up, and the hayfield got very wet, and all of a sudden these rushes quickly took over the hayfield. It's really a great area. And some more photos from our Inspiring Kids Preserve. The beavers, as I mentioned, have created or really enlarged a wetland that was already there. And you can see some of the animals that are attracted to that. We've got from the top left a great blue heron. Of course, there's the beaver. We've got a mallard duck, a green heron, and a common yellowthroat. And in this photo, there is a mink. I'm not sure if anyone can see it. This is a beaver dam or a beaver lodge there at our Inspiring Kids Preserve. And if you haven't seen the mink yet, there it is. It's that orange circle. And this photo is from our Decker Creek Preserve. It's also, you can see there's emergent wetland vegetation. And this is our Ecker Overholz Preserve, which is in the Green Cove Basin near the Evergreen State College. And this is from our Blooms Preserve. So we did an Oregon spotted frog enhancement project on our Blooms Preserve, and we installed 24 ponds, you can see in clusters of 4. And these ponds are meant to serve as breeding habitat for the Oregon spotted frogs. And around the outside of that, we planted a bunch of emergent wetland species. So that's kind of that sort of reddish orangey vegetation that you can see. And this is an Oregon spotted frog egg cluster. And interestingly, Oregon spotted frogs will only lay their eggs in emergent wetland vegetation. So that's why sort of restoring and protecting emergent wetlands is so important for the recovery of Oregon spotted frogs. They're a listed species, so they're obviously not doing too well. But we were really happy to learn that that there were Oregon spotted frogs on our Blooms Preserve property, and that through this enhancement of our habitat, we've created a lot of opportunities for Oregon spotted frogs on that property. So other animals at Blooms Preserve, from top left going clockwise, there's a green-winged teal, a Canada goose, of course, the Oregon spotted frog, and the trumpeter swan. And just wanted to give a shout out. So these are all from, well, not all of them. Many of these photos are from trail cams, and both Tom Terry, a Capital Land Trust member, and of course Mike Melton, help us out by monitoring and sorting through all of the trail cam content. You can imagine we do get a lot of different photos captured on those trail cams. It's pretty cool. And then open water wetland. So an open water wetland is a basin of water that's mostly unvegetated or covered with floating plants, and it remains flooded year round. So here you can see an open water wetland that's been backed up by a beaver dam at our Darling Creek Preserve. You can see several beaver dams along the trails we maintain at Darling Creek Preserve, which is open to the public. So if you haven't been out to Darling Creek, it's a wonderful place to go take a hike. There's about 3 miles of trails, 3.5 miles of trails, and it's really beautiful. And this is pretty cool. This is a river otter that we saw on in one of the beaver ponds there at Darling Creek. Here's another beaver pond from Darling Creek. And it's a lovely picture of a wood duck, also from our Darling Creek Preserve. They nest in tree cavities that surround these beaver-created wetland ponds. And these are wood ducklings in a nest box at Darling Creek. And this is thanks to one of our neighbors there at the property, Jermaine, for sending this photo. And this is a really cool photo from about, well, it says right there, it's from 2020. This was this was caught on a trail cam at our Tilly East Preserve. It's a bobcat, and it's part of a large wetland complex that's owned by Capital Land Trust, and there's also some state ownership in there as well. So yeah, a lot of different species use wetlands. And one thing I wanted to point out, you've probably noticed by now that there are sometimes two or more wetland types found together in the same area, as this photo from our Ecker Overholtz Preserve illustrates. Here you can see both open water and emergent wetland types. And it's also not uncommon to see emergent wetland types adjacent to scrub shrub wetlands or scrub shrub wetlands adjacent to forested wetlands. So they certainly, you can have different wetland types that are right next to each other. Now, moving on to saltwater wetlands, um, estuarine emergent wetlands are wetlands that are only flooded at high tide and have grasses and other emergent plants that stick out of the water and are saltwater tolerant. In the South Sound, a classic example of these are what we know of as salt marshes. And a very common salt marsh plant is pickleweed that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's edible and it tastes salty. And here you can see this is our Bayshore Preserve. That's all a pickleweed salt marsh out in front of it. And interestingly, when we first bought the property, it was a golf course, so they had a 1,400-foot tidal dike to prevent the salt water from flooding onto the fairways. And one of the first things we did is remove that dike, and that increased the salt marsh habitat on the property. This photo is from our Adams Cove Preserve on Totten Inlet. And our Twin Rivers Ranch Preserve, which is on Oakland Bay. And you can see it, obviously it's called Twin Rivers Ranch because there's two rivers or creeks. The one on the left is Cranberry Creek and the one on the right is Deer Creek. And then right in the middle, you can see that large salt marsh. And there's a lot of animals that live in and around salt marshes for all or part of their life cycle. From top left and going clockwise, you can see there's a bald eagle, which nest along marine shorelines, marine worms that burrow in the mudflats, juvenile coho that find refuge in pocket estuaries, and dunlin, which is a common South Sound shorebird, which probe in the mud for their food. They eat some of these marine worms. And then finally, estuarine intertidal. So an estuarine intertidal wetland is a type of wetland that exists in the transition zone between freshwater and saltwater with no rooted vegetation. And typically they're only exposed during low tides. And here in the South Sound, we know them as mudflats. So this is a great photo at our Inspiring Kids Preserve. This is Henderson Inlet, and this is a beautiful photo of a mudflat uh, down on the shoreline of our property. And this is our Randall Preserve and Allison Springs. It's the lower portion of Eld Inlet that I'm sure many of you know is also known as Mud Bay. So what are some of the challenges to wetlands? Um, there's physical impacts by humans, there's invasive species, and there's changing climate. So I'll just talk about some of these things briefly. Um, so humans often see wetlands as an impediment to land use and try to drain, dike, and ditch or fill them to make them go away. And this is one of the reasons we prioritize wetland protection in our strategic plan. In this photo, you can see an old dike constructed on a salt marsh in Oakland Bay to make it more suitable for livestock grazing. And these little rodents are called nutria. They're a large invasive rodent that we recently identified at our Blooms Preserve after we found a bunch of our newly planted wetland plants pulled up and eaten. Um, around our frog ponds. So we need to take care of those. Nutria were brought in to the U.S. from South America for fur production. They're very prolific, and unlike beavers, they don't build dams. Now, invasive plants are a huge threat to wetlands because they can outcompete the native vegetation, which greatly reduces the diversity and productivity that are the hallmark of wetlands. In our area, reed canary grass is public enemy number one. It is extremely aggressive and fast growing. It forms dense root mats that prevent other plants from growing, and it produces copious amount of seeds each fall. Reed canary grass thrives especially well in freshwater emergent wetlands. Now, the inset photo that you see here, that where it's just sort of bare soil, that's an area that was dense reed canary grass that we treated with herbicides for 2 seasons in preparation for a habitat enhancement project. In the spring of the third year, which is what this photo shows, there was almost nothing growing in the treated area. And then fast forward 4 months, and you can see it's almost waist high, and that is that picture with Melissa standing there. So even when we had it completely eradicated because of just all the seed source from the neighboring reed canary grass, it grew back almost immediately. But without the treatment, it would have been well above Melissa's shoulders. Now, one of the interesting unintended benefits of the treatments was that it allowed the native willows to get a head start while the reed canary grass was recovering from the herbicide. You can see a young willow on the right side of the main photo where that Melissa's holding. And it definitely wouldn't have been able to get established otherwise. So we're hoping that some of these willows will be able to at least make some headway against the reed canary grass. And then, of course, there are these other tree-eating rodents we know as beavers. Now, we love beavers and view their presence on our preserves as a sign of good ecosystem health, but there's no denying that they can be a hindrance to some of our restoration efforts, including wetland restoration. They particularly like to eat willow stakes, so we'll often put wire cages around our plantings to keep them safe. Some plants, like willows, will resprout after being eaten by beavers, but mostly it's fatal to the plant or tree that gets eaten. So this wraps up my presentation on wetlands. I hope it was interesting, and I hope those of you who are making popcorn are done now and are back so that you can look at Mike's amazing video. We look forward to continuing our wetland conservation work and celebrating future successes with you. Um, and with that, I'm excited to introduce videographer, photographer, and Capital Land Trust supporter Mike Melton. Mike volunteers to capture behind the scenes footage of the wildlife at Capital Land Trust preserves that we otherwise wouldn't be able to document. Uh, and Mike, I'd like to welcome you to introduce your short film. It's called Shaping the Sailless Sea, Beavers and Salmon. And there will be time for Q&A afterwards. So take it away, Mike.
I didn't realize the name was such a tongue twister.
Yeah.
I need to rethink that, I guess. Um, this story started 4 years ago when I first went out to Twin Rivers to do some videography for Mary and for Capital Land Trust. And I found the chum salmon starting their migration or the spawning run up the stream. And so I got some good footage of that process. And then the next year, I found a beaver dam at Twin Rivers that was blocking the flow of fish. And I was really excited to see how this fish managed to get past the dam. Well, unfortunately, somebody trespassed and went in and tore out the beaver dam before I had a chance to observe it. But the next year, the beavers were smarter and they hid their dam a little better. And so I was able to document this process of how the fish make it past the beaver dam. So that's what the video is about.
Wow. I'm just always so speechless after I watch this film. It's just incredible footage that you got, Mike, that you were there at the right time and able to capture this just dynamic story of beavers and salmon and how they really have evolved to live together, even though it seems like an impossible relationship. And I'm just so excited that the lands that Capital Land Trust conserves provides homes for critters like these and so many more through their beaver dam work. So we are now at the question and answer part of our evening. I'm going to tag in Capital Land Trust Outreach and Education Coordinator Sarah Croston. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for hosting our question and answer. So feel free to type in the chat any of the questions that you have, and Sarah will help work us through those. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, and thank you, Mike and Lauren, so much. Oh my gosh, amazing. As we wait for questions to come up in the chat, Mike, I'll start off with a question for you. Um, are there any other like memorable animal interactions that you've seen in wetlands besides the beavers and the salmon that you've observed in wetlands?
Oh, I mean, every day, right? I mean, yes, I've been one year I was out there working at Twin Rivers, trying to get some salmon footage, and a family of river otters came up past me, and they were whistling to each other. I never heard them whistling before, but they were coming up, and they would poke their heads up and look around, and then dive back down, and then whistle to each other. That was fabulous. But coyotes have wandered through, and obviously tons of ducks. Snow buntings sometimes show up on the salt marsh, which are really special migrant birds that come through. But there's always every day, and especially in the springtime, oh, so many hundreds and hundreds of migratory birds that come through that depend on wetlands. They need that habitat for food and to raise young. So the work that Capital Land Trust is doing is remarkable in preserving those habitats because the whole Puget Sound used to be like that before we showed up. And those spaces are few and far between. And what the work that Capital Land Trust is doing in preserving those habitats is just so critical for keeping these species healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just the other day I saw a group of mergansers swimming and a great blue heron like running down the shore. And I was like, whoa, this is a cool interaction to witness.
Yeah.
Um, so we just had a question pop up in the chat from Bonnie. Bonnie asks, can beavers help keep water on the landscape and help restore aquifers a bit into the late season, that is?
Absolutely. I just went to BeaverCon in Boulder a few weeks ago, and there's complicated topics in some of the western states in terms of water and beavers and water rights. But generally speaking, beavers do all kinds of incredible work with storing water that help recharge aquifers, but also help with preventing fires. because they provide wet buffers. So as our climate gets hotter, it's going to be super important to have more beavers and to protect more of these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have some questions rolling in now, so I'll try to work through them. So Mike Lay asks, is there anything unique about beavers in salt marshes specifically?
Well, I mean, they used to be way more common than they are now. I mean, because before humans were here, beavers would dam any type of water that was moving, frankly. And then, the Hudson Bay Company came in back in the 1700s and tried to exterminate the beavers all the way through to California. And so I guess the biggest issue with beavers and intertidal zones is that there are way fewer of them than there used to be. But the Capital Land Trust properties are very interesting because we have beaver activity in a lot of the shoreline habitats. At IKP, at Inspiring Kids Preserve, there's beavers right there in the salt marsh habitat. Twin Rivers, and even down at Randall Preserve, there are beavers that are intertidal beavers that they have a dam right there at the base of McAllister Creek. So, is there something interesting about them? They're fun to observe. But they used to be way more common than they are now because humans have developed those mouths of the creeks around the saltwater. So there are fewer of them,
Mm,
which has
yeah.
been detrimental to that habitat. We have more problem with sedimentation now and things like that because of the water flows are too rapid. So.
And Laurence, we have a question for you popping up in the chat from Cleve. Is Capital Land Trust cooperating with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to reduce bullfrog populations in wetlands?
Yeah, we are. In fact, we had U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service folks come out and do some bullfrog control at Darlin Creek because we were finding them there. And, Darlin Creek drains into the Black River, which is where the Oregon spotted frog are in the Black River drainage. And I think we're also going to do that at our Blooms Preserve as well. Try to deal with because we have seen bullfrog out there. Yep.
And then Mike, another question for you. Can beavers build dams in steep watersheds?
They typically don't. I mean, beavers will try to build dams. There's a certain flow rate that I think just doesn't work very well for beavers. It gets washed out too easily in steeper types of habitat. They like slower moving water that they can dam more easily and create a bigger wetland. So I haven't really had a lot of experience with the steeper type of terrain. But maybe, I mean, they don't like moving water, so.
And then there's another question in the chat too. So is there a similar challenge for young salmon when they're out migrating, trying to leave the creek and go out into the ocean with the beaver dams?
Well, chum are interesting because they don't spend any time in the creek. They leave, they hatch and they leave. They head right to the saltwater. They head to the estuary and then they spend a little bit of time there and then they head to the ocean. Coho, though, will spend 18 months in the freshwater. And so the beaver dams provide those deep pools, but they don't really restrict the motion because there's always some water moving through. And salmon fry have no problem getting through tiny gaps. So no, it doesn't really seem to cause any problems with that at all. In certain areas in other states in the West, there can be problem with fish movement through dams. And they sometimes have to take some action to help the fish get past them. But chum, no. And the beaver dams at Cranberry Creek never last very long. That stream is too flashy. There's a lot of degradation upstream with logging and housing developments, and there's a man-made lake up above it. And so the water flows are very heavy and they blow that creek out every year. And so the dam never really gets to last very long. They build it in mid-September and then it's usually gone by within a month. So, but they do still provide those deep pools. So it's good for the coho.
Hmm. And then this could be a question for either of you. Um, can either of you speak about the interaction of beavers and nutria? If there is an interaction, what does that relationship look like?
Maybe the beavers will teach the nutria how to build dams, and then we'll start to like the nutria more. I don't know.
Or maybe to teach them to chew off the branch, the vegetation rather than dig it up.
Um, and another question we have, specific to coho, can coho survive in fresh water if the stream dries up?
I would think not. They need to have cool water. So a dry stream is not going to be very conducive to that. And there's a problem in certain places with, again, with climate change, with waterways drying out. The lack of beavers has created a lot of problems because, entire streams have dried out and there's no life in that. So beavers provide that reservoir of water.
Yeah. And then this next question, Laurence, is for you. It's multi-tiered. One, has CLT mapped out other wetlands in the area which we'd like to take on to protect these areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are some challenges to conserving wetlands in that a lot of the funding that we get is for salmon habitat. And so, a lot of the wetlands here are not a lot, but there's quite a few wetlands that are separated from, a spawning environment and that typically salmon can't get to. And so for wetlands like that, it's really hard for us to get funding to acquire those. But we have been very successful with National Coastal Wetlands grants. That's through the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we've used those funding sources for a lot of our marine wetland properties. Like, well, you saw a bunch of them. So, Bayshore, Twin Rivers Ranch, Myers Point. Um, but yeah, we know areas that we want to conserve, and a lot of it is just finding a willing seller so that we can, move forward.
And then the next part of that question is, do you expect sea level rise to shift beaver dam locations further inland, for example, at Twin Rivers? And if so, is there enough protected area for beavers and salmon to move inland?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. And, fortunately, we're trying to conserve properties that are large enough to accommodate sea level rise and, sort of the retreat of species, both animal species and plant species, so that as the sea level rises, they can retreat back up, and we can still have a salt marsh, we can still have areas for beavers or yeah. Mike, it looks like you're thinking about something too. Have at it.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things when I was working on this video, when I was trying to think about the backstory of this area, is that, 20,000 years ago, this was all covered in ice. We were covered in a mile of ice. And so there weren't a lot of beavers and salmon in the Salish Sea. In fact, the Salish Sea didn't exist 20,000 years ago. So it's, they're very adaptable creatures, provided we don't eat them or we make hats out of them. So, there's going to be changes as sea level rise and climate change happens. The animals are going to have to adapt, and hopefully they can. I mean, beavers seem to be pretty adaptable. They're making inroads into places that they were, eliminated from many hundreds of years ago. But yeah, as the sea level rises, beavers will move where they can move to. So.
And Laurence, I'm going to end on a question for you. Are there any wetland conservation projects coming up for Capital Land Trust?
Oh yes. We always have projects in the pipeline, and typically, we're looking for habitat um, that corresponds to our strategic plan and that provides a lot of opportunities for a diverse set of species. So most of the projects that we're working on have some extent of wetlands on them, whether it's marine or freshwater. But yeah, there are several projects that we're working on right now that have pocket estuaries. So that would be sort of that estuarine intertidal wetlands. We're also working on our project in Oakland Bay right now to conserve about I don't know, I'd say maybe 30 acres of salt marsh. So yep, we always have stuff going on.
Awesome. Well, thank you two so much. At this point in time, I am going to turn it over to our development director, Allison, to close us out.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening. An extra special thank you to Mike Melton and Laurence for just sharing all of the wonderful wetland information. And tonight I wanted to give you all an opportunity to donate. So if you're inspired by tonight's presentation and you want to be a part of our mission to protect local lands, waters, and wetlands, please consider giving a gift. Every size gift matters and no gift is too small. We're posting in the chat just a way for you to click and go to our online donation page. You can also mail a check to our office. We're putting the address in the chat box. Thank you so very much for joining us tonight, for supporting us. I hope you have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thanks. Goodbye.